Hey guys, welcome back. We're going to continue on our 8.4 lecture here with our last couple of remaining examples. So, first, this will be our third example of spread of communism after 1900 is going to be Ethiopia. Ethiopia had been led by this guy here, who is Emperor Haile Selassie, who is a member of a dynasty that goes quite a ways back inside Ethiopian history. Keep in mind that Ethiopia is one of our examples of a very Christian area inside of Africa, and Haile Selassie, is an Ethiopian Orthodox Christian. Now, this is going to end up having an interesting twist on it because later on, he will be considered by members of the Rastafarian movement to be a reincarnation of Jesus. So he's a messianical sort of figure in the Rastafarian movement today. The Rastafarian movement isn't huge in the world today, but it does have something like 700,000 or maybe up to 1 million people that practice it, and he's a central figure. Anyway, Haile Selassie, he was very important in Ethiopia until the 1970s. And in 1973, a pretty massive famine broke out in Ethiopia, leading to a huge number of people dying. And so he eventually ended up getting overthrown by this guy over here, Mengistu Haile Mariam. Mariam was part of the military junta that overthrew the emperor in 1974. So, a military junta is where you have military leaders who are basically your government. He tried to grow Ethiopia's economy along communist lines following the Soviet model, and he led a brutal crackdown on opposition in 1977 to 1978 that is known as the Ethiopian Red Terror. His time as ruler led to the deaths of about 1.2 to 2 million Ethiopians. The next example in the curriculum is Kerala. I think that's how you pronounce it. Kerala is this region in India down here in the southwest that's highlighted in red. After India gained its independence from the British Empire in 1947, Kerala ended up voting in favor of a communist state government, uh, partially because they were opposing the democratic government that was being formed underneath the leadership of Jawaharlal Nehru. They preferred a communist government because it was promising land reform. Yet again, this popularism stuff that we've seen in Mexico and Brazil, for instance. Land reform in favor of getting peasants more land is usually something that's very popular amongst the lower classes. There were several reform laws passed between 1957 and 1969, which led to controversy with the rest of India, controversy that continues on even to today. These land reform issues continue, the most recent of them being in 2012. The last example in the curriculum is the White Revolution in Iran. So we will remember in 1953, the US promoted an overthrow of the existing Iranian government. But from 1963 to 1979, Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi led the reform program labeled white as the White Revolution because it was a revolution that happened without any warfare. He promoted land reform, yet again, very similar to the popularist governments. He encouraged women's suffrage, wanted women to have the ability to vote, and promised the elimination of malaria, among other reforms. There was this new chemical out called DDT, which is going to end up being a pretty major global issue. We'll talk about that more when we get to the globalization unit later on, but the land reforms ended up ending with new social tensions, and the Shah was overthrown in what's known as the Islamic Revolution of 1979. Crowds going up and down the streets chanting "Death to America" eventually attacked also the U.S. Embassy. There was a pretty famous movie about it recently, but get parents' permission to watch it. All right, that's going to take us to Key Standard 8.5, decolonization after the year 1900. Nationalist leaders and parties in Asia and Africa sought varying degrees of autonomy within or independence from imperial rule. And so you'll see from 1900 to present, just like everywhere, all places all around the globe are going to be impacted by decolonization. So, for example, India, right? The Indian National Congress had started back in 1885 to negotiate for independence from the British Empire. They finally succeed at creating a new state in 1947, but not one state, two states at first, Pakistan and India. And then, as we said later, 1971, East Pakistan would start transitioning into a new state called Bangladesh. The Indian National Congress is the secular political party that came to power after independence from Britain in 1947. Its first prime minister was Jawaharlal Nehru. Again, remember, Mahatma Gandhi had been assassinated by this time, and so Nehru became the new leader of the democracy in India. In Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh came to power. Minh was the communist leader of North Vietnam. He led the Vietnamese against the Japanese during World War II, where he actually received weapons and supplies and support from the United States because they were enemy of our enemy at the time. He led the Vietnamese against the Japanese during World War II, against the French until 1954, and was the chief leader of the fight against the U.S. from 1954 until 1973, when the U.S. finally withdrew. Next is Nasser in Egypt. This guy here, Gamal Abdel Nasser. Nasser helped to overthrow the monarchy of Egypt after World War II. He nationalized the Suez Canal, which almost ended up leading to World War III. The British didn't like the Egyptians taking the Suez Canal away from them, but the U.S. president at the time, Eisenhower, told the British that it wasn't worth another world war, backed down. Nasser was an opponent of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and advocated for an international pan-Arabian identity. After the end of World War II, some colonies negotiated their independence, while others achieved independence only through armed military struggle. So examples of those who simply negotiated for their independence, of course, include India, which negotiated for independence from the British Empire in 1947. The Gold Coast negotiated for independence from the British Empire. All of French West Africa ended up negotiating for independence from France, with the exception of Algeria, which ends up having to fight against France. Other examples are those who only were able to achieve independence because of armed military struggle, like Algeria from the French Empire. Algeria fought for and gained independence from France, partially thanks to the National Liberation Front, which won independence from France. Angola, of course, also will end up having to fight for its independence. In this case, it's independence from the Portuguese Empire. And not only do they fight for independence from the Portuguese Empire, a civil war emerged after Portugal withdrew in 1974, where the U.S. was trying to encourage one side and the Soviet Union was trying to encourage the other. Vietnam, of course, had to fight first to get independent from the French Empire, and from the Vietnamese perspective, fighting against the U.S., who they viewed as the next imperialists, until 1973. Regional, religious, and ethnic movements challenged colonial rule and inherited political and imperial boundaries. Some of these movements advocated for self-rule or autonomy. Examples of regional, religious, and ethnic movements include the Muslim League in British India, which fought for a separate state for Muslim people in South Asia. Muhammad Ali Jinnah and a lot of other Muslim people were really worried that the Muslim voice in India, despite having hundreds of millions of people, would be outvoted on basically everything because of the strong Hindu majority in South Asia. So when independence from Britain came in 1947, Pakistan and East Pakistan, which became Bangladesh later from 1971 to 1974, became a separate state. Next is the Quebecois separatist movement inside of Canada. Several attempts were made between the 1960s and the 90s to separate Quebec from the rest of Canada politically. The last referendum was in 1995 and was defeated with a close vote, not quite the 50% majority they were looking for. Next is the Biafra secessionist movement inside of Nigeria. The Biafra secessionist movement was created as a group of people called the Igbo, sought to recreate a short-lived state inside Nigeria that's known as Biafra. This movement has been accused of violence by the Nigerian government while espousing nonviolence. Next is the development of newly independent states. The redrawing of political boundaries after the withdrawal of former colonial authorities led to the creation of new states. Some good examples have already been mentioned, for instance, India, but Israel and much of the Middle East is also very good to mention. So, new states created by redrawing old political boundaries. This includes Israel. Israel had been something that the Zionist movement had been seeking to create now for quite some time. After World War II, there were some attempts at trying to get the new Israel to be created in Uganda, but the Jewish people were very strongly demanding that they get what they view as their traditional homeland, the land that they believe that God gave to them inside of the Middle East, inside of what we now today know as Israel. Now, of course, over time, Israel is going to get larger and larger and take up more and more territory inside the Middle East as this particular map shows. Now, these areas here in the West Bank, for instance, there's been some debate. Benjamin Netanyahu has recently been suggesting that Israel should take some of those areas. Next is Cambodia, Pakistan inside South Asia. The redrawing of political boundaries in some cases led to conflict, as well as to population displacement and or resettlements, including those related to the partition of India and the creation of the State of Israel. So, for instance, as India was becoming a new separate country and Pakistan was being created separately, there were just millions of people, Hindu and Muslim people, that were moving back and forth from Pakistan to India and vice versa. And in the process, there was about 1 million people killed in violence. This is the Gaza Strip, where a good number of Palestinian people have been relocated by the Israeli government. To compare this to where I live here in Utah, you can imagine like you took the entire population of the state of Utah and you put it all into a thin strip like right against the Wasatch Front. That's about equivalent to how many people are there and what the population density looks like. Ladies and gentlemen, that's going to be where I'll end this video today. I'll try to finish out the rest of Unit 8 coming up in the next one. Thank you. See you next time.